You're listening to the No Bullshit Vegan Podcast, episode 201. Professor of philosophy and vegan of 3 decades, John Sanbonmatsu joins me to discuss his new book, The Omnivore's Deception, and why the concept of ethical meat is one of the biggest lies we tell ourselves.
Welcome to the No Bullshit Vegan Podcast. Myth-busting and evidence-based advice to help you kick butt with your health and fitness on a vegan diet. Here's your host, Karina Inkster.
Hey, welcome to the show. I'm Karina, your go-to no-B.S. vegan fitness and nutrition coach. Thanks so much for tuning in today. I recently read John Sanbonmatsu's brand new book that just came out in June, The Omnivore's Deception, and I knew immediately that I had to have him on the show. So this conversation dives deep into the comforting myths that we tell ourselves about so-called ethical meat, the civilizational roots of speciesism, and what it really means to challenge the violent systems we're part of. John Sanbonmatsu is professor of philosophy at Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Massachusetts, where he teaches ethics, existentialism and phenomenology, and critical theory, among other topics. John is the author of The Postmodern Prince about Crisis of the Left, editor of Critical Theory and Animal Liberation, and author of the new book, The Omnivore's Deception: What We Get Wrong About Meat, Animals, and Ourselves. He's been a vegan and animal advocate activist for 30 years. His favorite meal is homemade pesto lasagna. Here's our conversation. Hello, John. Thank you for speaking with me today. Thanks for being on the show.
I'm so happy to be here, Karina. Thanks for having me.
I am honestly not sure I've ever made this many notes for a podcast interview before. So
I hope that's a good thing.
Oh, that's definitely a good thing. Yes. I'm looking forward to diving into some topics that we have not talked about on the show yet. But I would like to start with your vegan story. So I went vegan in 2003 when nobody even knew what it was. You went to a restaurant and they were like, "Oh, you're vegan. Do you want a chicken salad?" So how did you come to veganism? Were you vegetarian first? What's the story?
So when I was in college, I had a philosophy class, and we read a very famous essay by the philosopher Peter Singer called Famine, Affluence, and Morality. And he had argued in that essay that the reader of this had a moral obligation to donate 90% of their income to people in Bangladesh who were in the middle of a famine at the time. And the essay really kind of got me thinking about my own social responsibility. And then I think it was the next year, it was my first or second year in college, I came across a book by Singer called Animal Liberation, which probably many of your listeners are already familiar with, but that came out in 1975. This is in the 80s when I was in college. Mm-hmm. And Singer, had a simple argument, which is that, other animals suffer, and it's arbitrary to not take their suffering into account in our moral deliberations. And I was convinced that it was wrong to eat animals, kill and eat animals. And so that was 1983, I think. Within a few years, maybe I think 1986, I kind of realized that, my gosh, it isn't just the flesh of animals. It's all part of the same system. I mean, I had wanted to believe, I could have my pizza or whatever, with cow's milk, dairy, cheese. And then, you just kind of a light goes on and you realize it's a system, and there's no way to exploit animals ethically. Mm-hmm. So since 1986, I've been a vegan. 2 other things I would mention just briefly. One is that, I grew up with cats and dogs. So that was an important experience for me and my sisters. We got to see that other animals are individuals and have personalities, and that we respected them and included them in our family, really. So that was important. And also, I grew up with a lot of racism in New England. My father was Japanese American, my mother's Jewish. And so I had kind of had an outsider status, and I always empathized with people I saw around me being bullied, other kids, disabled kids being bullied or whatever. And so I think that sense of justice and injustice really went into my formation as a person, but then, eventually as a vegan.
Mm-hmm. So you've been vegan since I was born. Not to age us or anything, but I'm born in 86. So next year, It'll be 40 years.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah.
That's very cool. That's way before it was the cool thing to do.
Burke Breathed, or Breathed, I don't know how you pronounce his name, the cartoonist. I remember he did a strip back in the 80s about veganism, and, and I just people didn't know how to pronounce it. And, for years I would go to a wedding or something, and then I would, kind of with shamed faced, I have to explain I was a vegetarian. And so they'd come out with chicken or fish thinking
right.
that, or just as bad, some steamed spinach or wilted lettuce, and they would think that would make me happy,
Totally.
So the world has come a long way. But one of the things, that we might want to talk about today is the fact that in spite of public awareness of what veganism is and the proliferation of options, people are eating more meat than ever. Number of animals being killed is greater than ever. So it's not exactly a success story yet.
Mm-hmm. Not yet. Yes, we must remain hopeful. It's evidence-based hope, as some folks call it.
I like that.
Yeah. Well, okay, so you have a new book coming out, and your team has been very awesome in sending me the PDF version. So I've been going through that. It's coming out in June, which is probably around when this episode is coming out. So it maps very well onto that. But it's not out yet. And it's called The Omnivore's Deception. Yes, what we get wrong about meat, animals, and ourselves.
I had to show this book here because it arrived in the mail yesterday. It's not going to be published until June 17th, but I got an advance copy, and it is exciting after what feels like a century of work on the thing that it's done. It's in the can.
Well, so I'm going through it, and the current sense I get for what the deception is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's that the concept of ethically eating animals is essentially a lie. It's a societal lie. And it's this deception that allows us to uphold a violent system while we maintain this sense of moral innocence. And so I'd love to hear more about the deception piece, like how and why have we all been deceived?
I think I'm using the term deception to describe three different forms of it. On the one hand, there's the obvious fact that we live in a capitalist food economy where we're bombarded from the time we're born with millions of advertisements for burgers and steaks and barbecue and this and that. I mean, this whole cultural apparatus to hide what Carol Adams calls the absent referent, to say the animals who, of course, are dying for our sins of meat consumption from us. So that's one obvious way that we're deceived. Okay. Secondly, and this is mostly the theme of the book, it's what you just said, which is that we have an attempt by a variety of critics, including Michael Pollan, Temple Grandin, Barbara Kingsolver, and many others, to reassure us that we can have our meat and our conscience too. That there's the old bad animal agriculture, factory farming, and then there's this good, kind, compassionate, humane, sustainable animal agriculture. Mm-hmm. That's really what I'm tackling centrally in the book. I mean, I'm criticizing the whole animal system and the way we relate to other animals at every possible level, existentially, economically, politically, and so forth. But that has seemed really important to me in terms of the way that the animal system today is being legitimated, because in fact, you don't have to convince most people that factory farming is bad.
Right.
You don't have to convince most people that torturing animals is bad. Everyone's on board with that. But there's a loophole, you see, because as long as you can think, oh, well, if I wasn't, in the middle of nowhere, I wouldn't stop at McDonald's maybe because it's, bad in some obscure way. But, so in my heart of hearts, my conscience tells me that I'm a good person. And if only we could have, ethically grown meat, right, then it'd be okay. So that in a way licenses the consumer to participate in the animal economy. And that brings me to the third form of deception, which I also highlight, which is what Jean-Paul Sartre, the philosopher, called bad faith, which is to say, a lie told to ourselves. So there's this element of self-deception where most people they trivialize these issues. They participate in contradictory and indeed hypocritical forms of behavior. For example, in my opening chapter, I talk about the contributor to the Audubon Society and yet eats chickens and turkeys and ducks, the bird lover, and so on. So they're just, as you know, there are just a million of these contradictions. So it's really important to understand that this is a massive, historically unprecedented system of violence and violation and degradation. And most people, nonetheless, want to think of themselves as decent people. So that disconnect has to be, how is society to deal with that disconnect? Only through ideology, cultural reinforcement, and it has to be constant reinforcement. So every time the word vegan comes up, people are going to sneer and make fun of vegans. It's like not an accident that vegans are the most reviled group in the United States, other than drug addicts, according to polls, because it threatens the fundamental identity that people have. They don't want to give up their privileges of human supremacism, and they don't want to admit that what they're doing is wrong.
Absolutely. There's some points in what you've just mentioned that I want to go into deeper, and some of those are related to other writers like Michael Pollan and Temple Grandin. I've got a whole bunch of questions that are specific to those. So let's come back to those. Right now, what you're saying kind of sounds like what author and thinker Deb Gleason calls cultural coma. It's the cultural coma of food. And it's this cognitive dissonance that's involved, like the person who donates to the Audubon Society and then eats chicken. There's a potential cognitive dissonance there, or there's potential ignorance, but I'm thinking these days that's not really an option. We all know where our food comes from. That's not an excuse. So does this tie into your concept of what you call a civilizational error? So you're not just saying eating animals is wrong. You're saying that using animals for food is unethical, but also a civilizational error. So what do you mean by that? Is that related to this deception?
Yes. So what do I mean by a civilizational error? I mean that what we call human civilization, which of course is multiple civilizations over the course of thousands of years, right? But we've ended up with one kind of homogenized one to some extent, right? And that civilization or civilizations, but however we think about this, has been based on and continues to be based on this system of power and domination over all the other living beings of the earth. Mm-hmm. In other words, what we do to animals isn't simply wrong, in my view. We've built our whole identity, existential identity, around this system and the assumptions that go along with it about human supremacy, about the inferiority and really worthlessness of all the other beings of the earth. Now, most people would disavow hating animals. Oh, I don't hate animals. I don't, I love animals. I respect animals. But just prima facie, I mean, if you've got 80 billion land animals, not including invertebrates, insects, right, being killed every single year, and up to 2.7 trillion marine animals being killed every single year, and no one even knows those statistics, okay? Mm-hmm. And no one seems to care. I mean, I would say there is enormous ignorance there, that is still a thing. There's enormous ignorance in the public at large about what exactly happens to animals, how many. They really have no clue. Like when I ask my students, I say, well, how many humans are killed by sharks every year? They get that right. It's weird, I guess because it's a Shark Week or whatever, but they say, 5 to 10 a year. And it's like, wow, that's great. And then I say, well, how many sharks are killed by humans every year? And they think about it, and I get various estimates, but 500, the really risky students or whatever, risk-taking students say maybe 10,000. In fact, it's estimated to be 100 million.
Wow.
100 million sharks every year. And people just have no idea about it. So our aggression towards other beings spills over into our aggression towards one another, right? Whenever we want to denigrate another person or a group of persons, particularly, we always reach for the animal metaphors, right? And that's
right.
That's particularly true in cases of genocide, right? If you want to dehumanize the other, you invoke the animal. So there's a real problem with the foundation of society and civilization. And in a way, that's a core thesis of my book, that we have to realize that it's an error in a variety of senses. It's certainly a moral error. But actually, this error is leading to the destruction of the possibility of life on Earth, because animal agriculture and fishing, as you know, are the most destructive, ecologically destructive forces on the planet, even more than global warming, which, of course, is partly an artifact of animal agriculture. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to move the discourse away from simply, well, is it right or wrong to hurt animals, and take it out of moral theory and to really bring it into a broader perspective of how we want to live our lives on the earth. And do we want to live our lives as the demons of the planet, which is what we are? in terms of the atrocities we commit to against other beings.
Right. Well, that's something I'd like to go into deeper as well, is the parallels between treating animals and treating humans and, a lot of human atrocities. But one thing you mentioned just now is climate change, global warming. I mean, we all know at this point that animal agriculture is a huge, huge contributor. Greenhouse gases, biodiversity loss, pollution. I mean, the list is endless. Why do you think we don't hear more about this dietary side of things in mainstream climate discourse?
Oh, well.
Like, I went to a meeting, I've mentioned this on the podcast recently, I went to a meeting in my town of a climate alliance of probably 40 people. Guess how many vegans there were? Me. It makes no sense.
It makes no sense. And, I have not seen the movie, but there is a movie called Cowspiracy,
right,
which investigates this. I mean, it's been documented that the leading mainstream environmental organizations will not touch the animal agriculture issue with a 10-foot pole. I think for a variety of reasons. For one thing, because the people who run these organizations are as much susceptible to the brainwashing and the internalization of certain propaganda as anyone else. So they're speciesist, which is say they have this ideological contempt for other life forms, which is ironic since they're environmentalists. But then, of course, they don't want to anger their donors,
right,
by taking on a radical issue. They don't want to alienate their members. They don't want to alienate the public. Now, of course, this is counterproductive because, first of all, global warming is only one aspect of the ecological collapse, right? I mean, when Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring in 1962, which was, a huge bestseller and led to the creation of the EPA and environmental laws and so forth, there were no scientists really talking about global warming in the early 60s, maybe, one or two. So what was she talking about? She was talking about the poisoning of animals, with pesticides and so forth. One thing that really concerns me is the narrowing of discourse in environmentalist circles to this one problem of global warming without understanding even where it comes from. But anyway, to get back to your original point, it's the reason that you can go to, or you or I can go to these climate action workshops or conferences is it's denialism. It's an aversion to the truth of the matter, a kind of moral cowardice, and I would go further and say a kind of moral complicity in this violence towards animals.
It kind of reminds me of what some big name vegan doctors in the health space say about veganism. They often know that it's the answer, for personal health reasons or someone who has diabetes or heart disease or whatever it might be. But a lot of folks in the medical world just assume that veganism is too extreme. Like their patients are never going to be into it. And maybe there's some of that in the same sphere. Like, oh, it's just, yeah, we know it works, but we're not going to recommend that because it's too extreme. No one's going to follow it anyway. There's this kind of idea that it's too hard. No one's going to do it anyway. So what's the point?
Well, I've been thinking about a friend, was kind of repeating what they've been hearing in the media about processed foods, right? This is RFK Jr.
Right.
saying,
yes.
Well, we have to talk about, like, are you kidding me? I mean, not that processed foods are great or that they can't be a real problem, like, high fructose beverages and so forth. But like, we have this huge, as you know, raft of data showing, that vegans have lower rates of heart disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes. They live longer. My God, they even live longer than omnivore people on an omnivorous diet. So again, it just speaks to the entrenched nature of the system. Okay. Now, this is rooted in a material reality. Speciesism is not just an idea or a prejudice. It's a way of life. It's a form of economic power, right? We have these companies that have a stake in continuing to profit from the misery and production of billions of animals. And you have a public that's addicted to it, propagandized by it, and unwilling, as I said, to reconsider what it means to be human. And that's a kind of central part of the book too, is like, I'm saying there are different ways of conceiving of our life on the earth. And there's a better way to be a human being than this. There's a better way for our species to be than this. I mean, if we were to if we were to go to another planet and we saw some species that had built its entire infrastructure and culture and institutions and universities around the torture and murder of their fellow intelligent beings, we would think they were insane and we would want to steer around them. We would not want to land there. Well, we need a big, giant cosmic mirror to look ourselves in the eyes and realize and you know what's interesting, Karina, is like there's a sense in which, was it Goebbels who said, that the big lie is the best lie? I mean, it's just so obvious once you face it. And yet, because it's so ubiquitous, the system is ubiquitous, people don't see it at all. I mean, when I was researching this book, I would talk to people in different walks of life, faculty, students, or the general public. In my spare time, I'm a performing magician, and I would, talk to the lay public, just ordinary people. And if I would mention them, I was writing a new book, and they asked me, well, what's it about? And I said, well, it's about our violence against animals. They would look at me like they did no idea what I was talking about. And then they would try to be helpful and say, oh, you mean like people who abuse dogs, like dog owners? Is that what you mean? You know what I'm saying? So there's a sense in which it's hiding in plain sight. And, the work that you and I and others are doing is to hold people and say, look, it's like that movie, Don't Look Up. I don't know if you saw that, which was this satirical film about climate change denial. And in the movie, there's this asteroid coming to destroy the Earth. And all these, conspiracy theorists say it's just a lie and so forth. And then, spoiler alert, at the very end of the movie, one of these people who's been denying it looks up and you can see the thing actually coming down now. And the person says, it's real, look. It's like it's too late.
There's a lot of parallels there.
Yeah.
There's a lot of parallels to, you've mentioned thus far in our conversation already, to how we treat other humans. And maybe there's also some denial there, or some, like you said, you tell people what your book is about and they're like, oh, you mean like dog abuse?
Yeah.
And there's just no light bulb that goes on to the millions and billions of animals that we are mistreating every single year. There's probably some similar beliefs there about treating humans. Some people probably have no idea the scale to which mistreatment of fellow humans is happening. So you've mentioned genocide in your book. That's a big topic in, strong analogies between animal exploitation and various human atrocities. So I'm curious, though, how your position on that fits with other thinkers like Af and Sil Ko. They wrote Afroism. They say that we should talk about this in terms of interconnected systems of oppression, of mistreatment, rather than drawing direct comparisons. They say things like, you're not standing with me, you're standing on me. Where does your position fit in with thinking like that?
I don't shy away from talking about genocide and slavery in my work for several reasons. Well, let's take slavery first. There's, understandable concern among some animal rights theorists, philosophers, and activists, not to appropriate the experiences, say, of African Americans by using an, quote, analogy, right, to slavery in the New World and so on. But, in examining this question, it became clear to me that when we talk about slavery, first of all, we have to talk about ancient slavery, which was not a racialized form of slavery at all, right? I mean, it goes back thousands of years, and it was a very broad-based system. And furthermore, as we now know, it was based on animal agriculture. So actually, we enslaved other species first, and then began enslaving one another based not only on the same techniques of confinement and hobbling and control, but also the same ideological justifications, which is to say, well, some beings are by nature superior, some beings are by nature inferior, and it's part of the natural order for some groups to dominate other groups. This was Aristotle's view. And his views, reigned supreme for thousands of years and were used in the defense of racial or chattel slavery in the American South and so forth. So I think it's, first of all, really important to acknowledge that animal agriculture was the basis of slavery in the ancient world, and that there are these parallels that we can't deny. And in fact, I mentioned Michael Pollan's work and similar critics today who are defending enlightened omnivorism or humane meat. It's staggering that they use the exact same arguments, almost exactly the same arguments that past apologists for slavery used, both in the ancient world and in the United States to justify the slave system here. Now, regarding genocide, a similar thing, similar sensitivity, right? That particularly Jews are concerned about the misuse of the Holocaust and so on. Charles Patterson has an excellent book called Eternal Treblinka about our treatment of other animals. And there again also, I mean, what do we call what we do to, see, there's no word, the problem is there's no adequate language, right, to talk about what we do to animals. So it's not exactly slavery because slaves were not reproduced in order to be brutally killed. That wasn't, I mean, they died in horrific numbers. Millions and millions of people died in enslavement, but they weren't produced to be killed and eaten. So it's different, right? In genocide, same thing. I mean, that according to Raphael Lemkin, who gave us the word genocide in 1944, he was a Polish Jew who fled Poland and settled in the U.S., and then he spent the rest of the war trying to get the Allied powers to take seriously the idea that something different and quite perverse was happening in the Axis-occupied lands, which was what he called genocide, right? And genocide is an attempt to destroy the identity of a group, social group. As Jacques Derrida, the philosopher, pointed out, you know, what we do to animals is a form of genocide, but it's a peculiar kind because we're not trying to wipe them out entirely. We just want to reproduce them ad infinitum in order to kill them over and over again. So we have to recognize on the one hand that these are inexact terms, but it's important to use these terms not for their shock value, but to try to name what it is that's going on, what it is that's happening. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's how I...
Yeah. Well, that's kind of what I was interested in is like the background of using terms like this. And so the importance of historical context is something you've just discussed. So that's obviously part of the picture here. And the origins of slavery and how that relates to animal agriculture. The fact that there is no better language. So that's fair. You know, there's some arguments that it might turn people off using language like this, which, I mean, that argument is used for pretty much any social movement. I think that's pretty blanket level, you know?
Yeah.
But I think we can also agree that there are differences. You know, there's cultural meaning attached to what we do to other humans. But yeah, I mean, from a language perspective, not using it as a shock value, but just to describe what is going on, I think that's reasonable.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah. Just to reiterate, I would be totally against using any terms like these for rhetorical purposes.
Right.
And it's not about rhetoric. It's about structural, linguistic, semiotic, cultural parallels and intertwinings. I mean, the Nazi Holocaust, the German case, the murder of European Jewry, a lot of these leading Nazis, including Rudolf Höss, who was the head of Auschwitz, had backgrounds in animal agriculture. So that's not being rhetorical. That's like, well, whoa, what's up with that, right? Or Adolf Eichmann, the logician who was in charge of the Nazi bureaucrat in charge of the logistics of the Holocaust. When he escaped after the war, what did he do? He was raising Angora rabbits to be killed. I mean, again, they're not, as you were saying, it's not the same, what we do to other animals, what we do to other humans, but they're extremely similar, and the structures are intertwined. And, and that you mentioned Sill and Afko, and their work is really important, and other similar critics who are talking about intersectionality between different forms of identity and oppression. Super important. But as much as, I also talk about intersectionality, and not so much in my book, but in my classes and stuff. But it's important. The only problem with talking about intersectionality is we don't want to lose sight of the structures and how they work and the dynamics. We don't want to kind of get into an identity politics of, just thinking of the individual. You have to really look at structures of oppression as such.
Well, and I think looking at said structures of oppression and how they're all interrelated actually helps veganism as a movement, right? If we can look at ways to make veganism more accessible or to make the vegan movement less exclusive to only white folks, whatever it is, that's going to help the vegan movement overall. And that's a good thing for the animals, but we're also potentially focusing on human issues.
Yeah, absolutely. But there's another dimension to this too, which is that in my view, we will never liberate animals unless we liberate humans, because the system, and this is, kind of the point too, I think you're making, which is we do not live in a democracy right now, right? It's an oligarchy. We live in a system of capitalism, consumer capitalism, that tells us to focus only on our personal desires, that attacks empathy as a way of knowing the world. So these social issues are connected. And if we want to make progress as vegans or animal advocates, we have to understand those connections and the kinds of structures in society that need changing. It isn't just that we want to change or overthrow animal agriculture. We have to really look at the way the whole system of private property disenfranchises, the majority of humans too.
Absolutely.
And so, meat is a comfort, or animal products become a comfort food for people who are seeking that animal-human comfort in an alienating world, a world that doesn't meet their psychic or other needs.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think that's what intersectionalism, is that the right word? I think that's what it is.
Intersectionalism? Yeah, no.
Intersectional. Anyway. Yeah, I think it's important to keep in mind. I think it is overall a positive for the vegan movement.
Yeah.
So something that I wanted to go back to, though, which we've kind of touched on, but I want to ask you more questions about, is Michael Pollan's book that came out almost 20 years ago. I think next year it'll be 20 years.
That's right.
And so this book, The Omnivore's Dilemma, which I assume is related to your book title.
Yes.
Or vice versa. It did have a pretty profound effect on how folks, especially in the US, thought about food and farming and access and sustainability. But you're calling him the nation's foremost apologist for animal agriculture. And I have to agree with that. Of course, he popularized this myth that we can ethically, and that's in giant air quotes, kill and eat animals, right? So as long as you kind of feel bad about it, it's fine. It's part of our culture, as long as they come from supposedly happy animals, as you say in your book. So you're making the point that meat is really not meaningfully different if it comes from, a large-scale industrial operation or a backyard farm. I learned from Corey Davis, who's an agrologist, just a couple episodes ago, they all go to the same slaughterhouses anyway. A lot of people don't know that. So tell me more about this specific critique of Michael Pollan. There's a couple other folks in that same camp being apologists for animal agriculture.
So as you say, Pollan's book came out in 2006, almost 20 years ago. And he did not invent this discourse of humane and sustainable animal agriculture. The industry was already pivoting, certainly, and we see this in the organic foods industry. We see this in grassroots activism, a kind of agrarian renaissance developing in reaction to the Reagan administration in the 80s. So this was a long time in coming, CSAs. And what Pollan really did was provide what I call an intellectual scaffolding for these ideas. He's a serious intellectual, serious writer, journalist, he already written bestsellers. And what people who casually read Omnivore's Dilemma don't really notice, unless they're vegans, is how vicious Pollan is in that book towards animal rights, or antagonistic towards animal rights, towards vegans, towards animals. He kills animals personally. He goes out of his way in this book to kill animals himself so that he can kind of boast about it and talk about what it felt like. And so he has complete contempt, for non-human animal life. This book, it's impossible to exaggerate the influence of this book. It's part of this state-mandated curriculum in middle schools and high schools across the country. It's taught at every level. It's taught in graduate school, colleges. I just was on masterclass.com, if any of you know what that is. And sure enough, there's a special course taught by Michael Pollan about eating and about food. He is the go-to guy. And in my lifetime, let's say the last 20 years anyway, I've never, ever heard anyone criticize him in any forum ever about anything, because he's like, he really has this almost saintly aura. So it isn't just the case that book was influential when it came out. It's still doing the damage every day, every hour, across the country, across the world, to make consumers, make people feel that animal rights these people are lunatics. Animal agriculture is this wonderful tradition, and all we need to do is buy locally raised pork or whatever, and everything's going to be okay. And so that's why I do have a few chapters on Pollan specifically, because he's been so incredibly damaging. I mean, he's just one person, but he has an inordinate amount of influence.
That's a fair point. Well, in your book, you say that humane meat is the comforting bedtime story that omnivores tell themselves to go to sleep at night, which is a great way of putting it.
Well, I have to say that I don't say that. That was Carol Adams
Right.
in her blurb for my book. She's put it better than, I don't think I actually say that, but Carol does in promoting. But that is the message. Mm-hmm. Again, it's like a get out of jail free card. The animal advocacy movement has been pretty effective at getting people to understand that factory farming, quote unquote, industrialized agriculture is very bad, right? Mm-hmm. But the flip side to that is, especially animal welfareists have told the public that that's the problem. Okay. It's the way we're doing it, right? Whereas, you read Henry Salt's book, Animals' Rights in the late 19th century, or you go back, to Pythagoras almost 3,000 years ago, or Buddhists, 1,000 years ago. There are people who have been criticizing the instrumental, violent way we treat animals for, centuries and centuries. And it had nothing to do with factory farming, right? Industrialized animal agriculture is a 20th century phenomenon. But other, ancient thinkers and early modern and modern thinkers were able to see with clear eyes that, look, the problem is if you're going to treat another sensitive, intelligent, feeling being as an object, you are going to exploit that being and you're going to ruthlessly kill that being. That is problematic. And it doesn't matter, whether the being is raised in a factory farm or a smaller farm. And even on smaller farms and family farms, the animals are brutalized. And the treatment on those smaller farms really varies because there's no legal protection. So some farmers may be kinder to their animals than others who might beat them or abuse them even outside the normal violence of the system.
Well, if someone were reading this book and looking at some of these topics, violence in the system and, the cognitive dissonance is perhaps being chipped away at piece by piece, what would you say to someone who is super overwhelmed or paralyzed, has no idea where to start, they're not vegan, but they're thinking about all these topics that you've covered in the book?
Well, everyone should watch your show, clearly.
Clearly, John, clearly.
I mean, so what I tell my students sometimes is that the least we can do is become vegan.
Okay.
When I say the least, I mean okay, I've been a vegan for, as you noted, over 30 years, and things have only gotten worse. Mm-hmm. So evidently, being an individual becoming vegan is not enough. Okay.
Right.
These are enormously powerful interests, institutions, ways of life embedded in every aspect of the economy. And so we need movements, social movements that can tackle these relations of power and property and so forth. So it's not an easy task, but there's no quick fix to this. And I'm always concerned when, I see consumer vegans, for example, thinking that, well, all we need to do is get more people to eat vegan or we encourage vegan products. And, and that's fine in itself, but it's not nearly enough. Mm-hmm. And there's a kind of naive faith that's been expressed by Wayne Pacelli, among others. He wrote a book called The Humane Economy, arguing that capitalism is a force for good for animals. And let me tell you, having studied this, is not.
Right.
So, the idea that we can have animal liberation and capitalism, forget about it. Now, when people hear that, they think, well, what about communism? Sure, that's going to be bad for animals. And in fact, ecological Marxists are generally really as bad about animals as anyone else that I know. I mean, there are some wonderful, important examples, my friend Troy Vittesi, Marco Morizzi, and other theorists. But at any rate, so the individual who feels overwhelmed, my advice is, yes, you should try to move towards veganism. And the way to do that is to learn more about it and to not feel overwhelmed by it. It's not, once you know this yourself, once you become a vegan, a whole world of food opens up to you. You just realize that, my God, I've been eating the same thing over and over again. And actually there's like a billion things I could be eating. So it doesn't limit you. The funny thing is that once you eliminate animal products, you begin thinking about food differently. So that's the first thing. But beyond that, we need to, again, there has to be movement building. And that means connecting the animal movement. This gets back to your point about intersectionality. Connecting the animal movement to other social justice, socialist, organizations and movements that are capable of changing society at a fundamental level.
Right. Once again, intersectional veganism at the forefront.
There you go. Yes.
Okay, so one more thing before I let you go. And I realize, the burden of proof really should lie with those who are justifying harm versus the ones who are calling for nonviolence, right? But, a lot of people will say, well, yeah, of course, I would save a human over a toad, let's say, in an emergency. Are they being speciesist? Like, is that a moral failure? Is that part of what being speciesist is?
I mean, that's a really interesting question. I mean, is there something wrong? Like if, there's a car coming and I pull my kid out of the way first rather than my neighbor's kid, is that somehow discriminatory? I mean, not necessarily. I think we have certain attachments that matter. But here's the thing, with your toad example, no matter how differently we might feel about toads, there's no excuse for taking a toad out of nature and putting it in a laboratory to torture, okay?
Right.
We don't have to say in some abstract, schematic way, well, a human life is the same as a mosquito's life or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and I'm not averse to having those kinds of philosophical hair-splitting discussions. But the point is, if we take, the view of the Buddhists of ahimsa and so forth, of, practicing nonviolence and trying to do the least harm. So I go to the least harm principle, right? There's just no reason to be committing violence against other beings. And we don't have to get into a metaphysical debate about, well, is a cat's life really the same as... But the fact is that if you live with a cat, you realize that you can't just say, oh, well, they're just such an inferior being that, no, they're not at all they're not as valuable as my kid, because those of us who've had companion animals, whether vegan or not, we happen to be vegan or not, know that that life matters, and that the grief we feel when that life ends is as real, it is as deep, it is as meaningful as the grief we feel when a human dies. So we don't have to get into, I don't think we have to get into something like, utilitarian calculus and weigh this and that. You just think about human experience and what we can learn through our love and emotional connection with animals.
That's fantastic. I bring it up because it's something that I've come across in discussions. Honestly, I kind of feel about this whole concept like the desert island and vegan thought experiment that we get all the time. What if you're stuck on a desert island and there's only a pig? What are you going to do? It doesn't apply to real life. And also, if you're using this toad example to defend eating bacon for breakfast, like that's a categorical error. It's not something that people actually would use to justify behavior, but I feel like it's something that people use to attempt to pick away at some of the vegan arguments.
Totally. It's, I thought of writing a book about this. It's sort of like no matter who I talk to, whether it's like children or PhDs, everybody's gone to the same stupid school. And it's an interesting thing about a powerful system, because people don't literally go to a stupid school, and yet they all make the same stupid arguments as though they did, right? They pick it up through osmosis. Well, what about the Native Americans? They prayed to the animal before killing them. Well, if if everyone became vegan, there wouldn't be enough land to grow the crops on. I mean,
blah, blah, it's right? All the same.
The things that you're refuting these things on your show. But they're endless. And it's like, I hate to use the expression, but whack-a-mole, the game, which you're at the arcade and one thing pops up and you hit it and then another. Again, that is ideology. That's the power of ideology, of a system that's trying to disguise itself, obscure the truth, and that we buy into. Again, that's where the self-deception comes in, because people who make that argument, even if you show them that that's just dumb, like, these stupid reality TV shows where someone's on an island, like, well, what do you think the crew with the photography, the cameras are eating? They're like eating Twinkies in the back. Like, it's ridiculous. It's just a false. And then it also applies to humans, what we call lifeboat ethics, right? So that the Andean survivors in the plane crash in the 70s, they had to eat one another. Mm-hmm. Is that an argument for how we should be serving people up at the supermarket? Well, if they did it out of necessity, then yeah. So there's just endless layers to this mystification, and our job, and you're doing this on your show, is to peel those away. But as fast as we peel them away, people are throwing more. on.
Well, hopefully at some point it'll even out and the scales will tip, but I feel like what you're doing with the book and your courses and your work and your teaching and your online presence, it's all in that direction. And so we're very grateful for that work that you're doing. We are going to have show notes to link directly to the book and your website. What day is it coming out? June 17th?
Yes, it's coming out June 17th. And anybody in the Boston area, I'll be speaking at the Harvard Bookstore on June 25th. I'm going to be appearing in conversation with Francis Moore Lappé, personal hero of mine,
yes.
Who wrote a very influential bestseller called Diet for a Small Planet, which made a case for universal vegetarianism back in the early 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And that book sold over 2 million copies. And it was,
Well, that's amazing.
So she's a hero of mine. So again, that's on the 25th of June at Harvard Bookstore.
Excellent. Well, John, so great to speak with you. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, it was really terrific speaking with you, Karina. Thanks so much.
John, thank you again for joining me. Connect with John and order his book at our show notes, nobullshitvegan.com/201. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for listening to the No Bullshit Vegan podcast at nobullshitvegan.com.